Today's strategic discussion will explore the cascading challenges of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its profound implications for corporate governance as boardrooms navigate this geopolitical crisis. Some programming notes. Unfortunately, Jim Lee is unable to participate today, but we are delighted that Rob Barrett will be joining us in his place. We ask that you post all questions to our experts using the Zoom Q&A features. Any questions we are unable to address in this meeting will be addressed in a follow-up summary. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Chet Reske, partner at KPMG.
Well, thank you, Joan, and good morning, everyone. My name is Chet Reske. I serve our clients here at KPMG as a lead audit partner. I'm also an industry leader who's located in our Chicago office. And on behalf of KPMG, I'd also like to welcome you to today's session that we are co-delivering with our long-term partners at the NACD. As a global partner serving large multinational companies, I have a unique opportunity to engage with directors on a regular basis, both in and outside of board meetings. From my perspective, there's no question that the role of a director has become more challenging in the current environment. And the topics that we're going to be discussing today are presenting unique challenges for management and companies. Today, we're going to spend around 75 minutes talking about a couple of topics that deserve much more time. That said, we aim to provide insightful information and collaborate on supply chain and cyber issues in an effort to allow each of you to continue to enhance the valuable insight, oversight, and governance that you provide to the organizations that you are associated with. So with that, let me start by introducing our panelists today. First, I'm excited that we have Alex Brito from the Eurasia Group. Alex has been with the Eurasia Group for just about 20 years, and Alex leads the firm's coverage of the Russian foreign policy, as well as Ukraine and the broader Eurasia region. So he will bring some real-time perspectives on the environment that many of us are directly or indirectly dealing with. Next, one of my colleagues, Rick Parker, is with us today. Rick is a principal at KPMG, and he leads our cybersecurity practice. He brings over 25 years of cross-industry experience and has helped guide boards in finding the right balance between business performance and effective management of cyber risks. Finally, another colleague of mine, Rob Barrett. Rob is KPMG's U.S. Supply Chain Advisory Leader, where he focuses on supply chain and operations management consulting. Rob also chairs KPMG's Global Digital Supply Chain Investment Committee. So I invite you to reach out to me or any of my colleagues if you wish to engage in any of these topics after today's session. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Alex to kick us off. Alex?
Thanks very much, Chet. And hello, everybody. I'd like to thank NACD and KPMG for the opportunity to be here today on this panel. I really look forward to the discussion, and let me reiterate we really do welcome your questions as we're going along to help facilitate this conversation about this topic, this difficult topic of the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war globally. What I thought I'd do to start off with for our conversation today is to try and frame the situation, talk about where the war is and where it is headed, and some of the broader implications and questions that can be certainly the starting point for additional discussions here with my fellow panelists. By way of a bit of further introduction, sometimes the Eurasia Group name can be a bit confusing simply because we don't just focus on the Eurasia region, which we classify as being the former Soviet Union. We do look at regions, other regions around the world globally from a regional perspective. We also look at specific sectors of the economy, and it's been a privilege to work with my colleagues on these issues throughout our coverage of the war. But what I think is important is that it speaks to the idea that what is at its heart a regional conflict does have significant geopolitical and market ripple effects that are being felt now, and I think will be felt for a considerable period of time. And so today we hope to get at those issues and those broader implications that have been brought about by this war. A couple of other general points to start off with that I think are important for framing this conversation. Since the beginning of this war, the actions and reactions we've seen, whether it's the invasion itself or whether it's Western responses to Russia's invasion, have been outside the scope of what was assumed by many at the start of the war. And I think that while we have seen some signs, and there have been debates as to whether or not the attention on the war is going to start to fade in the West, I think it is still important to think through the implications of an environment in which we still see significant reactions and actions by various states and governments that are outside of what was expected. And I think that that's something that is likely to continue. I think another important point here is that certain aspects of the pre-war regional and global order are going to be permanently changed as a result of what we've seen so far. President Putin's relationship with the West is probably the most obvious example of this, but there are others as well with broader global implications, and we'll hope to delve into that today as well. But now let me talk about the situation with the war itself. To my point, my previous point about actions exceeding expectations, Russia's invasion certainly qualifies as that. I think, so for many, the question has been why Putin has taken the steps that he's taken. I think a critical factor that at the time of the invasion was overlooked by many, and I count myself as part of that group, was that Putin's risk calculus changed dramatically just in the last couple of years. It really was evident in the speeches that he gave announcing the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February and a speech 3 days earlier in which he announced his recognition of the independence of two regions of Eastern Ukraine, this Donbas region, which has been in the news lately. Putin's objectives were far more ambitious than many, including leaders in Ukraine, had anticipated. And it did seem clear from the outset of the war that his ambitions included political control over the entirety of Ukraine. But a key theme of this war that I think that we've seen has been that Russia's and Putin's political objectives have seemed to be disconnected with the capabilities of the military force that he set out to use in this conflict. So from very broad objectives at the outset, what we're seeing right now are more limited objectives. Russian forces are concentrating on an offensive to take over this Donbas region in eastern Ukraine and to secure parts of southern Ukraine, the so-called land bridge that would connect Russia to Russian-occupied Crimea. I would argue that probably if Putin was able to do more than this with the capabilities he currently has, that he would attempt to do so. But the reality is that 3 months of war have done significant damage to Russia's offensive capabilities. We don't know the exact number of Russian casualties they've sustained, but they are likely substantial, and there is significant loss of military equipment that's going to be harder to replace over time. Even with those limitations, however, the Russian military has shown recently that it can make gradual progress on its more limited objectives in Donbas. Ukrainian forces are facing setbacks there. But what has also been notable, I think, has been, and sort of a change from the outset of the war, is that it has become clear just how much agency Ukraine has in determining the course of this conflict and any peace agreement that settles the conflict in the future. Ukraine has been very effective in fighting back, and importantly, it has a lot of Western support in terms of arms and in terms of financial assistance. I think a significant factor here is that the destruction and loss of life that's already been seen on the ground is driving President Zelensky away from compromise or concessions at this stage. And I should say that the Ukrainian public is very much with him. A recent poll showed that 82% of Ukrainians do not want to make concessions to Russia on territory. So we expect Ukraine to continue counterattacking in certain areas And over time, it's going to be able to build up its forces thanks to more recruits and more Western military assistance. In this environment, the chances of a diplomatic breakthrough seem pretty remote. Neither side's really showing a readiness to talk. And I think importantly, Western governments are not putting a lot of pressure on President Zelensky to compromise with Russia or to make concessions to Russia. The attitude in Washington has been geared much more towards helping Ukraine, quote unquote, win. And we saw some examples of that in President Biden's op-ed in the New York Times just last night about what that means. That Western support to Ukraine is one of the drivers of another serious geopolitical problem that has risen from this war, and that is that NATO-Russia tensions are set to increase. Russia is angry about the arms shipments to Ukraine. They're angry about Finland and Sweden's likely NATO membership. And while the risk remains limited for direct military confrontation, that risk has risen significantly over the course of the war and will continue to do so. In the absence of conventional military conflict, there is a higher risk, arguably, of unconventional means for Russia to strike back or to retaliate in some ways. Cyber attacks potentially being one of them, and that could be a topic for further discussion today. Another key development or factor right now is the sanctions environment. The sanctions imposed by the West against Russia have been stronger than anticipated at the outset. That's been driven in part by public pressure on Western politicians to do more than they were comfortable with initially. So we've seen things like the freezing of Russian central bank assets or removing Russian banks from the SWIFT bank messaging system, things that were unthinkable prior to the start of the war. Also of note, though, is self-sanctioning that has been engaged in by companies, including companies involved in logistics, and the departure of investors from Russia. While there will be probably some stronger resistance to measures, big sanctions measures going forward, some governments are hitting their upper limits in terms of what's tolerable. There probably will be more sanctions coming along with tighter enforcement. And also critically, I think this is a grounds for where Russia might consider stronger counter sanctions than what we've seen so far. President Putin has shown recently with natural gas that he's willing to put big revenue generators for the Russian state into play to target countries for political actions. And so he may target specific commodity exports as well as target specific countries in lines with this. So what do we see going forward? Well, we have three scenarios that we've laid out. They're short term, they run through the beginning of August, but they do give an indication as to where things may be headed over the longer term. We see a situation where there will continue to be significant violence, unfortunately, significant loss of life and refugee flows in Ukraine, and also strong Western responses in support of Ukraine and against Russia, including more sanctions. This is going to have negative effects on global growth and inflation. And apart from Russia, Europe is going to take an oversized hit as a result of this. Our base case scenario, which we put at 70% probability, we refer to as an unstable stalemate, one in which Russia and Ukraine continue to fight, but neither of them makes sort of that significant decisive blow that leads to an end to hostilities. This is one in which NATO-Russia tensions are still very strong, but containable during in this scenario. The sanctions continue to be imposed, and they exact significant economic tolls on Russia in particular. But we also anticipate a loss of 1 percentage point of GDP globally as a result of this scenario. Inflation rising 1.5 percentage points higher than otherwise would be. Those pressures persisting into 2023. Unfortunately, our next most likely scenario is a downside scenario that we refer to as scorched earth, and we put a 25% probability. In this scenario, we would see much more intense fighting, much stronger Russian actions, and a higher risk of NATO-Russia conflict. In this scenario, we would expect to see a 2 to 2.5 percentage point drop in global GDP and a 2.5 percentage point rise in inflation as stronger sanctions than in our base case take hold and affect Russia and also affect other economies globally. Our upside scenario is only at 5%. And this is where a diplomatic solution might be found that would ease the tensions and might also ease the sanctions against Russia. But I think it's important to note that this kind of a scenario is one in which we would not expect a peace agreement to be imposed quickly. We think that sanctions easing would happen very gradually and would be tied to verification of Russian actions to de-escalate the situation. So this is something that even in the upside scenario, whether we're talking about sanctions easing and a peace agreement, or whether we're talking about our base case or a downside scenario, these are situations that are likely to last well beyond August 1st. In fact, I think we will be talking about this crisis in significant terms well into 2023. Now, there are a variety of broader implications of the crisis, and today we're going to focus on a couple of them, in particular, cybersecurity being one, supply chain risks being another. I did want to bring up a couple of other broader implications before I turn it over to my colleagues on the panel. One big issue, of course, that's worthy of discussion is how China is going to respond to this crisis. They are walking a very fine line right now between trying to show that there are limits to their support to Russia, but also trying to preserve a long-term strategic relationship with Moscow, which they find valuable on a variety of fronts. The U.S. has been careful about how they've dealt with this, but it is likely to add tension in the U.S.-China relationship over the long term, and that's going to add pressure on companies when it comes to this issue of decoupling between the U.S. and China. China will be taking lessons from the war, one of which is going to be how are the sanctions that are being imposed in this case used to deter and punish actions in the future, such as in a crisis over Taiwan. What's been happening right now with Russia are major steps against a country that is deeply integrated into the global economic and trade order in a way that other countries in the past have not been, and that's going to carry significant implications going forward. Europe is moving away from Russia on energy and other areas of trade and investment at an unprecedented scale, and that process is likely to continue. So what is that going to mean for Europe's move on climate policy and towards renewable energy goals, as well as for global trade trends? And how are other regions outside of the West going to react to this crisis? Western support has remained very strong on sanctions, and I think it is likely to continue, but many non-Western democracies are taking a less aggressive position against Russia. The case in point of India buying a lot of Russian crude oil has been a clear one, but other countries, including Brazil, have also been very careful about how they approach the situation. So what does that mean for relations between Western and industrialized democracies and other countries in terms of trade and in terms of sanctions enforcement going forward? So there's a lot to talk about, and I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues to talk about some of these other issues. In particular, let me first turn over to Rick and bring him into the conversation on the cyber threat front. You know, we've seen relatively limited news flow in terms of big cyber attacks. I think that was really anticipated at the start of the invasion. But let me ask you, Rick, how is the cyber threat greater today than sort of pre-war? And what questions should directors be asking regarding these heightened cyber threats?
Sure, and thanks, Alex. I think let's start with the first bit there is the threat landscape, right? Is there's the media cycle, and then there's the reality of what we're dealing with, not just at the board level, but operational footprint for cyber. And then there's the what we don't know, which is quite frankly the risk that we need to manage for. If you look at the beginning of the war, we had a very similar response that we did in the beginning of the pandemic. We expected a huge amount of traffic, a varied and somewhat asymmetric style of cyber warfare, where we didn't really know whether it would be state-backed type hacking, corporate-backed hacking, we'll call it separatist or activist types that, whether for or against Russia or Ukraine, just we expected to see a greater impact. And not to say that there wasn't, but I think the conventional war has really been the leader in what we've seen. And I don't know that is necessarily a total truth. It's just what we're experiencing today. And what I mean by that is the nature of cyber is it's undiscovered until it's there, right? Is the unknown unknown is what you're worried about. And we only have such capabilities. As you see in the media cycle on some things like third-party software events that have been big over the past couple of years, not to name any specific brands, but also in some of the ransomware attacks that may have been precipitated by third-party support for critical business services, technologies, data. And that's where we're expecting to see some of this. That is not only a profitable threat vector for the commercialized hackers, but it's also a strong and tried and proven vector for state-backed or affinity groups to those state-backed actors. So what does that mean? Diligence, right? Is when we come to the questions as a director, we think about a couple of things, right? We're worried about balancing the multitude of growth objectives for our organization. And we balance those with the risk that we're willing to take on as a business and say, if we have a certain amount that we can spend, what does it move on the needle from a protective basis? And is that worth the value at risk that we're protecting, right? Because we don't want to slow down the business too much. To use a crude metaphor is cyber doesn't want to be the brakes on the car that's going to slow you down to a crawl as you go through the turn, but rather we want to put your business up on two wheels and allow it to go through that turn gracefully like a good action sequence. And the problem in this kind of scenario is that's for proven and expected risks. Even the 0-day challenges that we see that you're not expecting, that's our regular everyday in cyber. This is a war scenario where we don't know all the actors and we don't know what their motivations are. And we also don't know what they're working on. It's always a black box that we're trying to fight. So as a director asking your CISO, understanding your cyber strategy is very important, right? What is the focus that we're working on? Is it business as usual, making sure, like, say we're manufacturing, pick, pack, ship, make, and build the products and keep them on the shelf and keep those systems going? Well, is that answering for the risks of the business? Probably not, right? So if we understand the resilience requirements of our business, the interdependencies that we have with the market, then we can start to look at what is that risk to the business from a revenue perspective, a production, a share space on the shelf, right? We see a lot of supply chain issues. To bring Rob into the conversation is, where does cyber, and in this case, resilience, meet in a convergence with the ability to put products and services in the market? And if we're a Western business, so let's say some of the bigger brands we've seen that have pulled out of Russia, if there is a meaningful attempt and sentiment to go after that brand for any public statements that their executives may make, something else to be careful for, the sentiment is a big case here. Or if it's a major flag, right? If a state-backed group or a nationalist group wants to make an example of that group, we as directors worry about the companies doing 1,000 things every day correctly to make sure that the business meets its growth objectives. Attackers only have to worry about one, getting in. And they have automated tools, capabilities, 24-hour help desks. They have all these things to focus on that one thing. As a director, we have to ask our CISO, how are we protecting against the fact that these specialized, dedicated actors can target us? And how do we know that we're putting the right defenses in the right places to detect and identify these challenges that are coming, but also to minimize the duration and impact of an incident that will occur, right? We have to accept that incidents will occur, not what if. They definitely are. We want to reduce the severity. And part of that now, I think, is the accepting that cyber risk is about diligence, about ongoing understanding and engagement by the board, just like you do an operational and enterprise risk, and just understanding it's under that umbrella. And then saying, in the same way we look at the resilience of our business, how do we look at our third-party ecosystem for systems, data, the outsourcing of our tools, technology, and capabilities that support our business? With the war specifically, in the beginning, and I'll just go back to what's the difference between now, a couple months ago, and now, is in the beginning, a lot of organizations were coming to terms with a lot of things were outsourced to the Eastern European region, and they didn't realize it necessarily because we think of India and Philippines and other areas as our natural outsourcing partners. However, over the past many years, a lot of software houses have taken advantage of the deep engineering skills within the Ukraine, Belarus, Georgian, Estonian communities, and now these are in the theater of war. And we had to think about how are we going to get those developers out or provide additional security for risks that we didn't think about in our software development lifecycle and supply chain. So that was a then. Now we're starting to monitor for those things because a lot of that is fettered out. Some people have been evacuated to safer regions, or we've been able to put monitoring in place to do things to make sure those are safe. But that doesn't change the ongoing threat. Right? As you don't know people, again, you don't know people's loyalties, you don't want to question them. So you have to start to think about what do we put in place to make sure that the business is protected? And that comes down to assurance and monitoring and capabilities, because it's really hard to protect against someone that has a dedicated bend on attacking your country. You're talking about the change in Putin in the beginning is we all maybe could have projected or telegraphed off what Putin's ultimate goals have always been for increasing the border of the empire. But the change in sentiment and the change in dialogue gave us cues, right? And the same way when we're doing cyber analysis, behavioral analysis can give cues to allow us to understand what people's proclivities might be and what might be occurring. We have to monitor the market, the dark web, social media, things like that. But we also have to take the balance of monitoring within our employees for insider threats, our partners for the same, and then within that ecosystem. This is a marathon, not a sprint, just like what you were saying. And the cascading impacts for cyber and technology risk, I think now that we're in the era where technology underpins everything, the ubiquity is also makes that risk a ubiquitous risk that needs to be in the ERM fold.
Thank you, Rick. Let me bring Rob into the conversation here, and sort of with a similar question, in terms of the kinds of changes that you're seeing in terms of supply chain risks and disruptions, and how companies are making adjustments based on what they're seeing or what they anticipate going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks for pulling me in here, and thanks for having me today, folks. I'd like to say somewhat tongue-in-cheek, there's never been a more interesting time to be a supply chain executive. I mean, it's been a tiring couple of years, to say the least. Supply chain professionals had to deal with just an unprecedented number of disruptions over the last couple of years. Whether it was COVID and the initial plant shutdowns and the disruptions associated with that turned into logistics availability and container shortages, port congestion, huge change in buying patterns and channels that you're fulfilling goods and services through. Then we had labor availability challenges at home, coupled with inflation and commodity price increases. And now we have the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and heaven forbid, something turned into a China-Taiwan situation. When I step back and think about that, there were a lot of changes afoot in supply chain pre any of this. In fact, we wrote a piece called Supply Chain New World Order, ironically, right before the pandemic, which talked about some seismic shifts, because most supply chains were designed 20 years ago, right? It was designed to take advantage of a low-cost country arbitrage play. It was designed for vertically integrated businesses to focus on their core and go to more partner-based manufacturing strategies, which created a greater reliance on a global network of supply partners. And I got a request from a client not too long ago that says, "Hey, can you share with us some of your thought leadership from about 15 years ago?" And I said, "Well, that's the oddest request I've ever received. Why would you want that?" They said, "Well, we want to know what was happening back then, because that's when our supply chain was designed. And it doesn't make sense given the world we work in, because the low-cost country arbitrage play is not necessarily there anymore. Just in time, and that level of efficiency has been exposed over the last couple of years. The long lead time supply chain coming out of Asia, doesn't account for the responsiveness of the consumer. The supply chain used to be responsible for purely making a good or getting ready to provide a service. It's now responsible for delivering on the brand promise. You know, how do I get it? Can I get it any way I want it? Can I get it, you know, where and when I need it? So if I look at all of that, you know, I'd say the last couple of years have just accelerated some transitions that were happening in supply chain where folks were thinking about, you know, where do I manufacture, and this notion of, you know, should I make where I sell and buy where I make, and start moving manufacturing closer to the point of consumption. So that gives me greater flexibility and product offerings, and also increases my responsiveness to the markets I'm trying to serve. So that shift was already happening, although that will take considerable time, because you're not just moving a manufacturing entity, you might be moving a whole set of suppliers that support those entities. But those transitions were already taking place. I know a variety of consumer-oriented businesses that had gone from 20% nearshore to 60% nearshore over the last 6 or 7 years, you know, that kind of a pace, if you will. In broad strokes, though, the last 2 years have really exposed a lot of supply chains. So they work really well when they work really well. And then, you know, you have all these disruptions over the last 2 years. And the number one thing I hear is folks say, oh my goodness, I don't have visibility to my supply chain. I don't know who's truly in it beyond my first tier partners. I don't know what supply I have access to, what inventory is sitting where. I don't know where things are in transit. I don't know when they're actually going to arrive. So I form these armies to go investigate and, you know, try to you know, paint a picture. So folks have been exposed on the visibility front. And this isn't just our point of view or anecdotal information. If you look at the software providers, the number one selling applications from the major software providers this year is in the visibility space. So every company we talk to would say, hey, I was really flat-footed in terms of my ability to see what was happening in my supply chain. I just trusted that it would work. And now I'm pretty exposed in this regard. So tons of investment going and solving that visibility problem for a variety of reasons. One is just figuring out who's in that supply chain so you can map out potential risks, where we have single points of failure, or we might be sole sourcing products or services from individual entities, and where those entities are physically located. And then also tactically from an operations standpoint, you can't manage what you can't see. So being able to see the flow of goods, the availability of products, and where things are, you know, in transit. You know, the second big thing we've seen is a rethink of planning models. So I hear companies tell me like, hey, we got lucky over the last 2 years. We made some bets, we made some wrong bets, but they were all bets. We weren't making informed decisions about how we run the business. And so they're rethinking their planning processes and the clock speed of their S&OP model. So if an S&OP cycle for most companies is, you know, 4 weeks, you know, some folks are saying, why does it take a month? You know, we need to be making decisions every couple of weeks, and we need to have, you know, the data to make more informed decisions. So we're seeing a ton of investment going into revisiting planning processes. The other interesting phenomena is most planning is designed to tell you what you need to go get. And folks are now doing reverse planning, which is what can I make with what I can get, which is something most companies weren't designed to answer that question, which is, hey, what can I make? And then CFOs have been approaching us saying, can you help me figure out, you know, what am I actually going to ship this quarter? So I can call the quarter, so I can tell Wall Street what we're going to do from a revenue standpoint. So those are some, you know, questions that we're often getting. So, you know, Alex, just to kind of open the conversation, I mean, supply chains are all situational. Everyone's got a different one. They might have more or less dependence on specific regions, specific companies, specific suppliers. I'd say everyone has some dependence, and I'm sure they've figured out exactly what that is on the Ukraine region and some of the raw materials that come from there. But I think the opportunity at hand at the board level is to look at the supply chain and say, hey, let's make sure we truly understand who we're working with across 1 or 2 tiers, that we can effectively model that risk and potential exposure, that we have tried and true tested war games and playbooks in place in the event that other things take place over the next couple of years. Don't shy away from the investment in visibility tools. You know, you can't manage what you can't see. And, you know, I think some supply chains have been starved for funding, right? They're usually a lot of the money in organizations goes to the front of the front office, if you will, sales, marketing, web presence, fulfillment, channel relationships, and we've seen a lot of companies that have been underfunded on, let's call it the back office supply chain procurement operations, and so there's some deferred maintenance there that might we might want to get after over the next year or two. Alex?
Thanks very much, Rob. And we encourage your questions in the Q&A chat. And as we're waiting for a couple questions to come in, maybe one question that I was curious about, and this kind of is relevant, I think, both on the sort of the cyber and technology side as well as in the supply chain side, is a lot of the talk when it comes to Russia retaliating with counter sanctions has been focused on energy, naturally, just given the importance of Russian energy exports. But one other area that's sort of been a concern, certainly a concern that I've heard about, is worries of other sort of metals or other raw material exports that could be affected. And this includes things like palladium or neon that could be important to advanced technology, high-tech production cycles. And then also, sort of coupled with that, you have the US and the EU focused on sanctioning advanced technology components and products to Russia. And this being a big focus, especially for the US wanting to limit the ability of Russia's defense industry, for example, to reconstitute the military forces that they've lost. And so enforcement in this area is going to be a big deal. So it does speak to this idea that there are sort of forces coming from both sides on this in terms of potential disruptions to specific sectors. And I'd really be interested in your thoughts about sort of how much concern is there out there on these issues. How are these risks mitigated, things like that, because it does seem like in addition to some of these big headline areas, we are going to see disruptions that are going to be relevant to very specific economic sectors.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. So a couple things that I might say is and things that we're seeing. So a couple trends. One is a lot of companies now are truly trying to understand the circularity and options within their product set to minimize the dependence on virgin materials. So, there are methodologies and standards. The World Economic Council for Sustainable Development partnered up with Circular IQ, and KPMG was involved in this consortium to develop a way to approach and study circularity. So I've seen a huge uptick on circularity to understand where can we better reuse, recycle products to reduce dependence on critical and highly constrained raw materials. And so that's something, I think I would encourage companies to look at how a product is manufactured, how can it be designed and developed in a way to increase its circularity. As a practical matter, as an example, there's a high-tech client of ours that runs huge server farms. And when they look at those pizza boxes that go in that server farm, the average lifespan of that pizza box might be about 3 years from a useful life. However, the DRAM on some of those boards have a useful life of seven years. Historically, it didn't make sense to try to harvest and recycle those chips. However, given the chip shortage and given some other circumstances, it does make economic sense entirely to create a new reverse supply chain where they can take those old boxes, strip them down, harvest those chipsets, and have them available for reuse. So I think there'll be, I think every company that makes a physical product will need to look at opportunities to increase the circularity of their products to reduce dependence. Number two is you're not going to reduce dependence entirely, and you may not be able to alternatively source some of those critical materials. So what do you do then when we get in a hyperinflationary period as it relates to some of these commodities? Like look at the chart of lithium. Over the last 18 months, I think there's a 10x plus increase in the cost. So that's when you'd probably need a very good cost to serve model that truly reflects fully allocated costs across the product set. And I've seen companies do this. It's not easy, but it can be done where you can truly allocate your costs down to the customer, order, SKU, channel, region, such that when you do see price increases, you're able to quickly pivot and understand what the margin revenue impacts are on specific products for specific orders with specific customers, and then see if there's an opportunity commercially to get recovery for that pricing. That's just practically speaking. We're all trying to run businesses, and companies have come to us and said, like, we don't know how to quickly understand how to take the inflationary prices we're seeing as it relates to labor, transportation, commodities, and get some form of recovery from our customers, or how to appropriately allocate and or pass on along those costs. And so without an appreciation for your complexity model and your true cost to serve, you won't be able to do that adequately. So we're seeing a lot of investments go there as a quote unquote partnership between, let's say, finance and operations, kind of joining forces to truly understand, where all the money goes, so they can make some, better, more informed commercial decisions to align with what might be happening on the price side for critical components.
Rob, when you're looking at this micro, I don't want to call it micro segmentation, but this micro financial model that you're looking at, where you're seeing very granular level details. I'm looking at some of the questions. I'm looking at things like ESG and that being top of mind for a lot of organizations. You're talking about the circularity. But I wonder a couple of things. Is when you look at the pandemic and you look at the war and you look at chips is a great example. There was a shortage before either of those two things that has only been compounded with palladium and gold and neon, particularly with the Ukraine. But also looking into staples, right? Is we see the wheat issue and other staples coming throughout the European region. Where do you see the innovation cycle coming into this? Because we're now looking at globalization as a challenge. We're looking at a new world order of globalization as a bigger cascading challenge. And then we're looking at sanction, counter-sanction frameworks that could make just cost and inflation spiral out of control. How does that play into the innovation part of the supply chain and supplying us, the end consumer?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because innovation comes from situations, right? Like I'll give you an example. So it used to be that you remember Webvan from back in the day? I don't even remember the 90s. What a great concept, except it was well ahead of its time, and it failed. And if you look at like grocery in general, and you look at the margin on grocery and basket of goods, it was never economically viable to do delivery until a bunch of things were in place, until some delivery networks in place and options were in place. So let's call it Uber, Lyft, and some other folks that are able to actually deliver goods. But the number one problem was really like the pick, pack, and ship of products. And it wasn't until you had some innovation like an Ocado, who went to zero space warehousing and fully autonomous Hive-driven technology across those warehouses to help with pick, pack, and ship, that you could perform in-home delivery of grocery profitably and have a profitable e-grocer as a consequence, right? So that took a lot of different things to get to that point. I think I'm not sure I have a crystal ball on like where the next supply chain innovation is going to come fully as a consequence of this disruption, and where I know companies continue to invest in I4O and plant level automation and robotics and other techniques. I know there's we're exploring with driverless vehicles and technology to hopefully augment or reduce logistics related costs. We're going to have to get better at that if we're going to want to bring manufacturing back closer to the point of consumption in industrialized markets. So there's going to be tons more innovation going into, let's call it, connected manufacturing. I think we're seeing a lot of innovation going just to connecting all the nodes so that the 10,000 companies that are collectively make up the supply chain can operate as if they were one virtual organization. You see micro pockets of innovation, like this I'll give you something practical, Rick, which sounds silly, but everything, a lot of companies are PO based. Oh my goodness, what a bunch of paperwork, right? You have 1,000 procurement professionals pushing POs. Do you know that for most manufacturing companies, the PO changes approximately like 9.6 times before it's fulfilled? Like if you have 20,000 POs that are changing roughly 10 times per between fulfillment, so call that 200,000 POs, on a monthly basis, like, and all the people managing that inefficiency, like those processes are broken. So we're seeing companies revisit their processes to say, why am I doing a plan and then you replan my plan to give to someone else to plan to somebody else? Why can't we just plan across 5 nodes as if we were one vertically integrated company? Or why do I even need POs to trigger the movement of goods or services? Why can't we just operate off that plan we agreed to and eliminate all that unnecessary paperwork and the people and the congestion associated with it? So I think we'll see innovation in terms of just continued automation. I host a chief supply chain officer peer exchange, and we get 30 chief supply chain officers together from all different industries. And universally, they say that they are doubling down on digitization efforts, right? To automate plants, to improve the flow of information, to get better visibility, and try to change the paradigm for how they operate across these entities. So I think we'll see innovation in a lot of those, dimensions as a consequence of the myriad of disruptions and how should we say, supply chain new world order over the last couple of years.
So, one of the things we think about for cyber risk and technology risk is concentration risk, right? And that's a very similar thing for supply. And one of the things we look at is as journey to cloud or this digitization of supply chain comes, is the concentration of providers. And over time, so one thing we can't control right now is the compression of supply and expansion of demand, but we know that that's going to drive the innovation in the technology. And now we've got, I don't know how many you have in your industry. Let's say we have a half a dozen major providers. Just like we look in cloud, there's like 3 major hyperscalers, or well, if you count Alibaba and some others, there's a handful more, but it's still a small group. And that concentration we see, like when there's network outages and everybody thinks Facebook's down, it's like, no, the internet is actually down. Somebody pulled the plug. What kind of play, or what kind of impact, rather, is the better word, do you see of this concentration factor as the world becomes smaller, right? You're talking about going to one virtualized supply chain, which I think is what we obviously need, right, to support this global ecosystem of consumers and demand. But how big is that risk become, not just from a cyber perspective, just all disruptions?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to look at the question that you were asked. So from a technology standpoint, there's an arms race going on in supply chain right now to see who could build the bigger network, right? So, if you look, whether you're a big giant ERP provider, or whether you're a niche provider, it's like, who can hook up the most partners, and whoever builds the bigger network wins, which should bring down some economies of scale, should give us greater flexibility to pivot as to who we work with within the supply chain and how we provision capabilities. But to your point, we'll probably end up with 3 networks. Who are they going to be? Maybe, the SAP Ariba network. Microsoft's now committed to building a network. You got, Oracle, you've got some niche providers. So, there's an arms race to build a network, which I think will drive efficiencies, but also creates risk. Go a completely different direction. A lot of supply chains are designed where they have 50+% sole source supply in them. Now, why is that? Well, it's more efficient. Like, you're not gonna, if you're an automotive, you're not gonna have duplicative supply. They might have 65% of their suppliers, single source, which is by design for cost and efficiency, but exposes a ton of risk. Right? Because, of the financial health of that particular business, whether they're online or offline, geopolitically, where are they located, the lead time associated with them, their dependence on other critical supply elements. Like, those are things that we got a heavy dose of having to monitor as a result of the financial crisis, a little over a decade ago. And I think we're seeing the exact same thing right now. So if we didn't learn anything from the financial crisis, in terms of monitoring risk exposure from sole source suppliers. And we're seeing that again. I think it's high time that companies invest in at least tools to monitor. I'm not saying you should dual source all your components. That would make, that would not make any financial sense, but at least understand what the risk is, how to monitor the risk, how to get ahead of the risk, how to anticipate it, and have a playbook in the event that something happens to that critical, cog in the wheel.
So Alex, hearing this bit that we're talking about and thinking about it from the world you live in, right? In the policy, the international playbook world. And I hear as we concentrate more and become more reliably interdependent, as we're going to be in a supply ecosystem, how does this become a tool in the current and post Russia-Ukraine Cold War that could happen, that says, and I'm thinking about specifically the news in the past couple of weeks about how we have to be careful about who we're doing business with if they do business with Russia, is now we have this centralization on a small bit. Do those providers now become accountable to the sanctions regime that says, okay, now SAP is providing supply chain to Russia and its friends, you got to go shut all that down? Is that a viable impact? Because if it is, I think there's a huge destabilizing force surrounding that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that at least for now, what we are going to see is sort of steady and fairly strong enforcement of these kinds of strictures, especially coming from the US. But what I think has been notable throughout the war has been the level of unity between the US and Europe on these issues. There was a lot of, if you remember back to the sort of the Trump administration era, a lot of question about whether or not there would be some sort of fissures and divisions between the US and Europe on sort of how they enforce these strictures and the like. I think a couple of things have changed in this current crisis. One is that the Biden administration was making a concerted effort to try and unify US and European positions on these very issues. They were really they were doing their homework, they were putting in the legwork, they were achieving a certain degree of success in that prior to the invasion. I think the second factor here simply is the scale of the war itself. The levels of destruction, the actions by Russia, and I think also for many European leaders, the fact that with some exceptions, they feel like their relationship with Putin is broken, and they can't reconstitute a relationship with Russia with Putin leading. And so what that means is that you do have this stronger enforcement mechanism, this stronger cooperation on these issues, to the point where I think one of the debates that will be developing going forward is whether or not US and European governments should be looking at secondary sanctions or related measures to try and stop the Chinese or Indian governments from encouraging sort of cooperation with Russia. But what I think that does mean for companies that have had sort of direct or indirect connections here is that there will be pressure. And it will come from governments to a certain extent. There will be understanding, I think, to a degree in terms of trying to unwind relationships, decouple relationships over time. But ultimately, the effort is to try and isolate Russia at the moment in an attempt to try and force policy changes in an environment in which Russia is probably not going to change its policies that much. So that cycle just sort of is going to continue. I think during sort of for the foreseeable future, and based on the scenarios that I described at the beginning, I don't see a clear pathway for many of those sanctions and restrictions to be sort of lifted. I think another factor here, one of my colleagues often refers to this as the TikTok effect, or this is the TikTok war, where social media dispersal of news from Ukraine, developments in the war are fueling public opinion. They have for the last few months, and that really has driven politicians to get out in front of these issues. And I think it's also, to a point that you were making, earlier about how sort of third-party actors with cyber attacks targeting companies potentially for their investments and their activities connected to Russia. Some of these things we're also seeing in terms of public reactions that lead to politicians to make decisions. Some of that may start to ease in the coming months, I think, because some of the attention is going to be a bit more limited, from publics, and that may have an effect. But I think, in general, that trend is going to continue and is going to affect companies. So I did want to just take a moment here. I know that Rob will need to leave in just a couple of minutes here, but just to offer him a chance for some closing thoughts and comments about sort of what we're going to see going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I do apologize for folks that I do need to leave a little bit early, but thanks for letting me join you this afternoon. As board members, I would say, here's an opportunity to assess and take a step back. I know the supply chain folks are weary right now, right? It's been 2 years of nonstop change, turmoil on the demand and supply side. That said, we need to, as individual companies, take stock of what worked and what didn't, and where we need to shore up parts of the business to, fix points of exposure and make those critical investments in the appropriate processes and or infrastructure. I also would challenge folks to rethink their supply chain segmentation so that we have truly purpose-built supply chains that we go into eyes wide open. So if we want the hyper efficient, potentially longer lead time supply chain, which has a lot of sole source dependencies in it, we know that, and we deliberately did that. Others, we might pivot from just in time to just in case and take on, the additional costs of that working capital deliberately because we're trying to design a supply chain a certain way. And I think there's also a heavy lift, which might say, hey, we're going to consciously decide to bring large portions of a supply chain more near shore, or should I say less dependence on, longer lead time Asia-based partners. Whatever those strategic decisions are, I think now's the opportunity to step back and look at what's happened over the last 18 months and invest in the supply chain from either a design standpoint, a process standpoint, or in some cases, an enabling technology because there's going to be another set of events and world circumstances. There's always going to be disruptions and changes. So as much as we invest in front office, there might be, time to challenge the back office and to make the appropriate investments in how they're designed to build as much resiliency as reasonable into the business and to, be aware of kind of where all the money goes such that they can make appropriate decisions on the commercial models with your customers. So Alex, thank you for having me, and Rick, thanks for good to see you again. And thanks for letting me join you guys. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and look forward to the next time I can speak with y'all.
So Alex,
Thanks,
I'll jump in here. Thanks, Rob. Alex, there was a couple questions in here I wanted to come back to. Focusing targeting on the board question for sure what happened when Rob dropped. I lost my video, but I guess I'm back. Yes. Okay. Awesome. So board challenges. I'm gonna base the conversation in up until everything of the past 2.5 years, through dozens of conversations with boards every year. All the questions center in 3 main categories. What is our strategy? Meaning, what direction are we going from a business aligned risk management perspective for cyber and cyber architecture? Are we getting there fast enough? And what are we missing, right? The challenges of the past couple of years have expanded those conversations into a little bit of a segmentation among those questions. And part of that has been the third-party risk, very adjacent to supply chain as we've been talking about, and product security as well. Another is talent. And I saw a couple questions about this, and I want to address it because technology more broadly is a problem, but cyber is a very big challenge in the war on talent and the future of work. This is not my data, but it is real data. There were over 800,000 unfilled cyber jobs in the US at the end of last year and 3.5 million globally. That's not getting any better. Our universities are not going to be pumping out experienced and seasoned cyber professionals at any meaningful rate to address that, which means that we are, as organizations, relying on companies like KPMG and our peers in the marketplace to provide more talent. The problem is we face the same challenge. So from a board perspective, understanding, interfacing with your audit groups, interfacing with your security teams to understand that you have the talent to meet the challenge, not just of today, but of where your business is going. If you're backfilling talent for today's needs, then you're already behind, because you're filling some gaps, but that's not where your business is going. And a great example of this is the journey to cloud, digitization of the business, like Rob was talking about, is the capabilities, the service catalog, tools, and technologies that we have for cyber for an on-premises enterprise are not always the same, very frequently not the same as what we use in the cloud environment. Yes, it's just having your environment in somebody else's house, but you don't necessarily have the same control, so that the capabilities you need are not necessarily the same. And those people have different skills. And it also is, this is more, even though it's not as emerging now because cloud has been around for a long time, it's still emerging from the capabilities we're placing the cloud and putting more of our business remote to take advantage of a myriad of different opportunities there, like not owning the technology refresh, even though you're still kind of paying for it. There's a whole arbitrage and cost there for different reasons that also can be attributed to the lack of talent. So as a board director, not living in the space, because a lot of board directors don't necessarily have that tech or cyber background and know, hey, are we having the right talent? Is how do we drive towards that? What do we understand? What are the questions we ask our CISO, our chief risk officer, our chief audit chairs that say, how do we know we have the right people to do what we're doing? And I think that there's a collaboration between HR and talent professionals and those groups, as well as business functional assessment to say, do we have the right people and the right skills and aimed in the right area? And that comes to cyber and tech debt. Is we were building for so long, like they said, 20-year-old supply chains and supporting those as well as other technologies. We have all these people focused at things that may be legacy to our business and may not where we're going. So we need a transitional plan. I liken this to how do we transition heartland communities that were focused on manufacturing or energy generation or agriculture, how do we bring new skills there? Well, it's a similar thing, is we have to bring new skills to the technology talent that have institutional knowledge that we have, so we also don't lose their understanding of our risk dynamics in our business and bring them forward to the new technology so we don't have that shift. Why lose great people just because we're going to new technology when the market doesn't have people to fill those chairs? So we have to have a dynamic solution to the talent gap that we have, because it's not necessarily, we have people, we just need to help them modernize their skills in some areas. That is a risk. It's a huge cyber risk because the threats we are facing are always at the end of the envelope. They're called 0 day for a reason, is we didn't see them before we just found them. Just like a new virus in the body, it's a new virus in technology. And how can we expect people that don't have, even the people that do have 20 and 30 and 40 years of experience in tech, have trouble finding these? How do we expect the new people? So that also leads to technology innovation. And the board should be pushing for implementation of, and when I say this is there's a bit of trust play here, is we have to help push the providers to develop better technologies to support force multipliers, so the technology can help us to be able to analyze more of the tech environment to look for threats, but at the same time, the tech isn't necessarily mature enough yet there. So there has to be a business provider relationship to push the development there. And the board should be pushing the CISO for more automation and innovation. So that's just coming back to a host of 3 or 4 questions that I saw in the piece there. I want to come to you, Alex. There's a lot here, right? And like we said, there's a lot to unpack in what's going on, and this isn't going to be over in the 4th quarter. calendar or in a metaphorical sense. How do board directors, other than watching the media and saying, how do board directors think about this in the long-term change and pivot to business strategy, business planning, and just general awareness of how this will impact them in a global way?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's, I mean, first of all, I think you're right to sort of lay out a long time horizon for this kind of crisis and sort of what it brings, because I think, even if, and we have a question here about, how the conflict resolving and whether or not things start to get a bit more back to normal in terms of investment in Russia, or what this is going to mean longer term in terms of other crises. I think one thing to keep in mind is that, first of all, there are going to be lingering effects of this crisis regionally and globally. I think regionally, it's going to take a long time for Russia and Ukraine to get back to sort of semblances of normalcy, I think, just because these sanctions will be complicated in terms of them coming off anytime soon. I think and of course for Ukraine, there's massive issues in terms of reconstruction and sort of return of economic growth. This is going to be a very long-term issue where they will have significant Western support. Conversely, for Russia, there's going to be a lot of Western governmental pressures on them over time that are going to complicate things. But I think, I think what we need to keep in mind, sort of in terms of the broader picture, maybe, is that this crisis is going to be one in which, will, I think, inform how governments respond to additional crises in the future. And I think, there was a question here about Taiwan and sort of the potential for, whether or not we can anticipate sort of the next crisis, just given that there were a lot of people, including the US intelligence community, talking about a Russian invasion of Ukraine, many experts sort of missing those signals, and then sort of the implications flowing from that. And I think that what we're going to see is an attempt to sort of take lessons learned from this crisis in terms of the warning signs that a situation is more than just sort of a sort of small garden variety crisis. We see in the Taiwan case, for example, we see cases of provocations one way or the other that sort of lead to questions as to whether this is going to be a big crisis. But trying to identify what is the bigger, what constitutes something out of the ordinary in these cases, understanding that when it comes to certain types of crises and situations, there are going to be outsized responses from governments. Prior to the Ukraine invasion, if anybody asked, what was the U.S. government's priority, Taiwan or Ukraine, there was no question that the answer was going to be Taiwan. And we've seen what's happened in terms of the Western response for Ukraine. So you can expect something that's going to be significant, not just militarily, but I think also in the economic sphere as well. And even in that kind of just given the magnitude of the U.S.-China economic linkages, I think you're going to see significant implications stemming from that, whether we're talking about cyber issues, whether we're talking about global supply chains. Sort of an order of magnitude bigger risks there as well. So I think the other thing that I would just say, to close out the comments here on this, is that we're in an environment in where there's no sort of clear leadership authority, globally to try and resolve some of these issues, whether we're talking about security crisis or whether we're talking about environmental climate policy kind of issues. We're seeing, still a great deal of dislocation in terms of how the U.S. and the West views many of these issues, how China and many other developing democracies view how many developing democracies and then authoritarian states like China view these issues, and that's going to be complicated as well. And so I think for board directors, as they look at these issues, they're going to have to think of a kind of environment in where a lot of these issues are going to be very hard to resolve at a policy level. Nationally, it's not going to be so clear cut in terms of what different countries or different regions are going to do in response as well. But it looks like we're coming up towards the end of our time here. And Rick, thank you very much for all of your observations, and thanks to all of the questions from our audience as well. I'd like to now turn it back over to Joan for some final words.
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Rick and Rob, for just an your strategic insights on this complex and challenging geopolitical crisis. Before I move to final closing, let me just ask if each of you take 1 minute and give us a takeaway.
Sure. Yeah, I'll go ahead and then Alex, hand it back to you. I think if we're thinking about cyber in the long term, if you're a board director, and there's a lot of things that are going to become more and more relevant from an accountability perspective for the boards as the SEC and others start to put some more cyber responsibilities on your position. When we look at everything Alex has been talking about, and we've been talking about in this conversation, particularly with Taiwan and others, there's a lot of different pressures on your business that may be cyber adjacent, that may result in some cyber play. As NATO changes and we have Finland and Sweden and other countries becoming more drawn off the sidelines, as it were, this expands the field of play for cyber. So understanding where your organization lives, the interdependencies between your market, whether it's geographic, socioeconomic, political, whatever that may be, could make your organization a target. So understanding the sentiment towards your organization is important. The days of a 15-minute cyber update at the board are long gone. Your three main constituencies, your customer, your investor, and the regulators expect more. And I think we all should owe it to our organization to do more and to become better students of this, not just as cyber professionals myself, but as board directors. We own the responsibility and accountability to those constituencies that allow us to sit as directors. So I would say diligence and understanding and awareness for the long term for cyber. And thanks for the opportunity to speak to everyone today.
Oh, excellent. Alex, your closing thought?
Well, thank you again for inviting me to this panel. What I would say is that we're dealing with a crisis that will continue over an extended period. As I said, this is not something that is going to end by our August 1st scenarios. It's going to last longer term. But I think also what boards will need to consider is that there is plenty of potential, unfortunately, for other crises to emerge at the same time, that different governments are taking different lessons from what has taken place here, both in terms of what Russia has done, but also in terms of what the US and the EU have done in terms of sanctions, in terms of trying to disconnect an integrated economy out of the global economic and trade system. There will be a lot of implications from that. I think Chinese leaders will be taking a lot of notes on this in terms of the potential for crises to develop between them and the US. And so while watching for the continuing sort of implications of what we're seeing specifically tied to this war, we'll also be needing to think a bit more about sort of the next crises and how what's happening today is going to be affecting those outcomes in the future.
Excellent. Again, please join me in thanking Alex, Rob, and Rick for this exceptional program. We also want to thank the Eurasia Group and the Chicago chapter sponsor, KPMG, especially Chet Risky, Mark Velisenko, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes with the Eurasia Group to bring today's program to life. And finally, to the NACD Minnesota and Colorado chapters for their partnership in presenting this program. We also want to thank our audience for your participation and thoughtful questions. We ask that you take a moment, please, to complete the survey. The link is posted in the chat box. This concludes today's program. Thank you for attending and remain safe. Thank you.